At 9:55 on a quiet spring morning in 1917, a factory in Pennsylvania vanished. Not burned, not damaged, gone. In less than 4 seconds, an entire building collapsed into a crater. The blast rattled windows miles away. People in nearby towns thought an earthquake had struck. In some places, the sound arrived before anyone understood what had happened. Inside that building, hundreds of workers had been standing shoulder to shoulder just moments earlier. When the dust settled, more than 100 of them were dead. And the most unsettling part of the story is this. The factory had been designed to explode, not by accident, by design. But the engineers who created that design had only imagined a single mistake, not the chain reaction that would erase the entire structure from the landscape. To understand how a building could disappear in seconds, we have to step back into the industrial world of wartime America, a world where production moved faster than safety, and where the quiet rhythm of machines hid a danger few workers fully understood. The year was 1917. Europe had already been at war for nearly 3 years during what would become known as World War I. Across the Atlantic, armies were firing artillery shells at a rate that previous generations could barely imagine. Millions of shells every month. Factories in Britain and France were already stretched to their limits, and they began turning to American industry for help. One of those factories stood outside Philadelphia in the industrial town of Eddystone, Pennsylvania. The plant belonged to the Baldwin Locomotive Works, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the United States. Originally, Baldwin had built railroad locomotives. But war changes industries, and by 1915, part of the company's vast complex had been converted into something very different, an ammunition loading plant. Thousands of artillery shells arrived there empty. The job of the workers inside the factory was to fill them. Every shell that passed through the building would eventually be fired on a battlefield thousands of miles away. When the United States officially entered the war in April 1917, production demands skyrocketed. Factories like Eddystone were suddenly operating at the very edge of their capacity. Machines ran constantly, shifts stretched longer, new workers were hired as quickly as possible, and many of those workers were women. At a time when much of the male workforce was preparing for military service, women stepped into industrial roles that had once been closed to them. Inside the Eddystone loading buildings, hundreds of them worked side by side along long production lines. They weighed powder charges, they filled metal shell casings, they tamped the powder down with mechanical presses. Then they passed the finished shells along to the next station. Hour after hour, shell after shell. The work was repetitive, fast, and tightly organized, but management believed it was relatively safe. After all, the material being loaded inside the shells was not TNT. It was black powder, and compared to high explosives, black powder was considered stable. Under normal conditions, it burned rather than detonated, which meant the risk of a catastrophic explosion was thought to be low. At least, that was the theory. The industrial disaster itself reflected the safety thinking of the time. It looked almost fragile. Instead of thick, reinforced walls, the structure was built with lightweight materials, wood framing, thin panels, minimal reinforcement. To a casual observer, it might have looked like poor construction, but the design had a purpose. Engineers believed that if an accident occurred at a single workstation, the light walls would blow outward. The force of the blast would escape the building instead of traveling through it. In theory, this would save the workers stationed farther away from the ignition point. It was known as frangible construction, a structure intentionally built to break apart under pressure. If one station ignited, the building would sacrifice part of itself to protect the rest. The idea made sense, as long as one condition remained true. Only one station could explode at a time. But by 1917, the factory floor was no longer operating under the conditions engineers had imagined when the building was designed. Production had accelerated, deadlines had tightened, and the number of shells present inside the building at any moment had quietly increased. Every station along the production line now held partially filled shells. Some were empty, some were filled, some were already sealed. Each one represented stored energy. Each one was waiting for a trigger. Workers didn't think about it that way. To them, the machines were simply tools, repetitive, familiar, almost boring. A typical shift might involve filling hundreds of shells. Weigh powder, pour, tamp, move the shell forward, repeat. After the first hour, the routine became automatic. The body learned the pattern. Hands moved without conscious thought. In many workplaces, that kind of rhythm is the goal. Efficiency grows when workers no longer need to think about each step. But in a munitions plant, routine can hide danger, because the system depends on small conditions remaining perfect. Powder must remain clean, metal tools must remain smooth, machines must be maintained, dust must be controlled. If any of those conditions slip, even slightly, the process can change in ways no one notices until it's too late. And by the spring of 1917, the system at Eddystone was beginning to drift away from the conditions it required to stay safe. Factories under wartime pressure rarely slow down. They speed up. Contracts demanded enormous output. Delivery dates were fixed. Every missed shipment meant fewer shells at the front lines of the war. So the machines kept running. Maintenance intervals stretched. Powder residue accumulated in corners and on equipment. Workers became tired. Long shifts blurred together. The production line continued moving. And along that line sat dozens of shells containing tightly packed powder charges. Individually, each one was manageable. Together, they formed something far more dangerous, a chain of potential detonations. The engineers who designed the building had assumed a single ignition point. They had not fully accounted for what would happen if that ignition reached multiple loaded shells at once. Inside the loading room, the distance between stations was only a few feet. Enough space to work comfortably, not enough space to isolate an explosion. That detail mattered more than anyone realized, because on the morning of April 10, 1917, something inside that building finally broke the fragile balance the system depended on. The exact cause has never been confirmed. Investigators later proposed several possibilities. A grain of foreign material mixed into a powder charge, a worn metal tool creating friction, a spark produced by static electricity. Each scenario could have produced the same result, a tiny ignition. At first, it might have been no larger than a flash of powder, the kind of accident the building was designed to contain. But that assumption depended on something that was no longer true. Nearby shells were already filled, packed, and ready to transfer their energy to the next. Within a fraction of a second, the pressure from the first ignition struck the nearest loaded shell. That shell exploded. Then another. Then another. The reaction moved faster than any human response. Not like fire, but like falling dominoes made of explosives. Inside the loading building, the morning shift had been running for hours. Machines pressed down in steady rhythms. Metal casings moved from one station to the next. Workers leaned over their tables, repeating the same sequence they had performed hundreds of times before. Weigh the powder, pour it into the shell, lower the tamping press, slide the shell forward. Reach for the next one. Nothing about the moment suggested danger, but somewhere along the production line, something changed. A spark, a grain of contamination, a moment of friction. No witness ever saw the exact cause. What investigators later concluded was simpler. At one station, black powder ignited. Under the original safety theory, that should have been a small event, a single flash, perhaps an injured worker, perhaps a damaged machine. The building's lightweight walls would burst outward and release the pressure. But the theory assumed something that was no longer true. Nearby shells were already loaded, packed tightly with powder, waiting only for energy. When the first ignition sent a pressure wave outward, the nearest shell absorbed that energy. Instead of burning slowly, it detonated. The explosion struck the next shell, then the next. Within milliseconds, the production line transformed into a chain reaction. Every loaded shell became the trigger for another. Detonation raced through the building faster than sound could travel through the crowded machinery. The frangible walls that were meant to protect the workers never had time to respond. Instead of venting a single blast, the structure was struck by dozens of explosions almost simultaneously. Wood beams snapped, steel frames twisted, and then the entire building disintegrated. The event lasted less than 4 seconds. For the workers closest to the first ignition, there was no warning. For those at the far end of the room, the explosion arrived before the brain could even process the sound. Human reaction time averages around 0.2 of a second, but by the time anyone might have turned their head toward the noise, the chain reaction had already crossed the room. Where a factory had stood seconds earlier, there was suddenly nothing. No walls, no roof. Only a rising cloud of dust and smoke climbing into the sky. The energy released inside that building did not remain within the plant grounds. The shockwave rippled outward across the surrounding town. Residents miles away heard a thunderous roar. Some believed an earthquake had struck. Others thought a train had derailed nearby. Windows shattered in homes throughout the area. In the nearby city of Chester, people rushed outside to see what had happened. Even in distant neighborhoods around Philadelphia, the sound was strong enough to rattle glass. Within seconds, a column of debris and dust towered above the industrial complex. Workers in neighboring buildings froze. Then they began running toward the site. Where the loading building had once stood, they found a crater, twisted metal, fragments of equipment, scattered shell casings, and almost nothing recognizable of the structure itself. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the scale of destruction made it painfully clear that many workers inside the building had not survived the blast. The explosion had been too powerful, too sudden, too complete. For some victims, identification would prove nearly impossible.
Emergency crews and factory workers worked through the debris for hours. Stretchers moved back and forth across the ruined ground. The injured were rushed to nearby hospitals. Doctors and nurses struggled to keep pace with the sudden influx of patients. Meanwhile, families began arriving at the factory gates. News traveled quickly through the community. Hundreds of women had been working inside the building that morning. Mothers, daughters, sisters. Some were teenagers who had only recently joined the workforce. Many families waited outside the plant, hoping their loved ones had been assigned to another building that day. Others searched the hospitals for familiar faces. As investigators counted the victims, one problem quickly became clear. No one knew exactly how many people had been inside the loading building when the explosion occurred. The factory had expanded its workforce rapidly to meet wartime demand. Records were incomplete. Some employees had been hired only days earlier. Others were temporary workers whose paperwork had not yet been fully processed. As officials compared employment records with family reports, they confirmed at least 133 deaths. But even that number came with uncertainty. because there were almost certainly more people present than the records showed. The true total may never be known. In the days following the explosion, federal investigators arrived at the scene. The United States had entered World War I only 4 days earlier. That timing raised an immediate and troubling question. Had the disaster been an accident or an act of sabotage? The fear was not unrealistic. Just months earlier, a massive explosion had destroyed a munitions depot in New York Harbor during the Black Tom explosion. That blast had shattered windows across Manhattan and damaged the Statue of Liberty. Investigators eventually traced the attack to German agents attempting to disrupt American war supplies. With that memory still fresh, the idea that another ammunition facility had suddenly exploded seemed suspicious. Government agents began searching the Eddystone plant for evidence of sabotage. They interviewed survivors. They examined damaged machinery. They reviewed security records. But as the investigation continued, a different explanation emerged. There was no evidence of outside interference, no bombs, no infiltrators, no signs of deliberate sabotage. Instead, investigators found something more complicated. The disaster appeared to be the result of several small weaknesses in the system, none of them catastrophic on their own, but together they created conditions that made a chain reaction possible.
In the days following the explosion, federal investigators arrived at the scene. The official inquiry eventually reached a sobering conclusion. The explosion had been caused by ignition of black powder at one loading station, but the real failure lay in the system surrounding it. Too many shells were present in the building at the same time. Stations were positioned too close together. Maintenance and contamination controls were insufficient for the pace of production, and the building's frangible design only worked under conditions that no longer existed. It had been built to survive a single ignition, but it had been filled with dozens of loaded shells. Once the first detonation occurred, the structure had no chance. The building had effectively become a storage container for a chain reaction, and when the reaction started, nothing could stop it. The tragedy at Eddystone was not the only explosion of its kind. In January of the same year, another massive accident had occurred in London during the Silvertown explosion. That explosion destroyed an entire neighborhood and killed dozens of workers. The underlying causes were disturbingly similar: rapid wartime production, overloaded facilities, and safety systems designed for slower conditions. A year later, yet another ammunition disaster would strike Pennsylvania during the Oakdale ammunition plant explosion. Each event forced investigators to confront the same reality. Industrial systems built for speed can become dangerous when pushed beyond their limits. The machines themselves rarely fail dramatically. Instead, small weaknesses accumulate quietly until one moment triggers the chain reaction.
In the days following the explosion, federal investigators arrived at the scene. In the years after the war, safety regulations for ammunition plants began to change. Engineers revised their assumptions about how explosions spread. Factories were redesigned to increase distance between loading stations. Limits were placed on the number of shells allowed inside a single building, and new construction standards required stronger separation between hazardous operations. These improvements did not eliminate the risk of explosions, but they reduced the chance that a single ignition could destroy an entire facility. In a grim way, disasters like the one at Eddystone became lessons written in engineering manuals, lessons paid for with human lives. Today, the original factory complex no longer exists in the form it once did. The crater left by the explosion was eventually filled. New buildings rose in its place, and over time, the physical evidence of the disaster faded. But the story remains in historical records, in congressional reports, in newspaper archives, and in the long list of names recorded as victims of the explosion. Many of those names belonged to young women who had stepped into wartime factory jobs only months earlier. Workers who had come to the plant expecting an ordinary shift. Workers who had no way of knowing that the machines around them held enough stored energy to erase an entire building in seconds. The factory was designed to fail safely, but the system around it changed faster than the design. And on April 10, 1917, that difference lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough to leave a crater in the ground, and a lesson in the history of industrial safety that engineers would study for generations.